Hello, I'm Justin Ross. I'm with Professors Coady Wing and Beth Cate of the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Professor Cate is a professor of law specializing in constitutional law, Supreme Court decision making, and data governance and regulation. Beth, thank you for coming because Coady and I have been very eager to talk to you about the trade offs between personal rights, freedoms, and the ability of our society to respond to the pandemic, which for everybody's health might require us to prevent people from doing just anything they want. So, to start us off, Beth, I think we all know that there are always these tensions and rights. Like you have the freedom of speech, but you can't risk everybody's safety by yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. Are these principles being uniquely challenged under the stresses of policymaking in the COVID-19 response, or do we have enough precedent that just makes this all a pretty straightforward application?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Um, I, I would say that we're somewhere in between, right? Because we are a common law based system and we rely on precedent, necessarily that means that the law evolves drawing on principles that have gotten enunciated in prior cases to deal with the challenges of the day. And so, on the one hand, we've have had prior pandemic situations before in our nation's history. It's been a while, but we've had them, and we've had other times when, because of war or other circumstances, there have been sort of tremendous kind of stresses, if you will, that create a need to balance individual liberty with dealing with some major public need. And so there is definitely case law out there that I think people are drawing on to try to figure out how to deal with COVID related challenges. But there's still going to be, a need to figure out, okay, how do we apply this in this situation now? How do we analogize to what's gone before? And that's the nature of our common law system. So, you mentioned fire in a crowded theater versus, the rights of freedom of speech, or that as an exception to the rights of freedom of speech. And speech is one of those things that's raising some of these issues. There have been some stories over the last few days about, for example, a law in New Jersey that is a criminal law that would criminalize spreading false information or fraudulent reports that cause public alarm. And that's a more general law. You could imagine that being applied in a number of circumstances. Currently, police in New Jersey are reportedly saying, hey, if you're spreading false information about the coronavirus and that's going to cause a big public upset, um, we're going to prosecute you. Okay. Which
Do
has
they
in
have
turn
to
raised a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just because do they have to do they have to know that it's false? One of the things that I find difficult these days is just I can't tell if people know if they know that they're saying something false or not. Just
Yeah, or they're just repeating. Well, actually, I mean, the First Amendment creates a whole lot of space for people to not just, tell things that are untrue and they don't realize they're untrue, but the First Amendment actually protects a lot of lies, actual lies. Although it draws the line at fraud that has a sort of measurable, harmful impact on someone. Like if I defraud you in a commercial transaction and my speech related to that as part of the fraud, it's not going to be protected by the First Amendment, for example. So typically, yeah, to fall outside the scope of the First Amendment's protection, you have to pretty intentionally lie and lie in a way that's going to cause a significant harm. So
The law in New Jersey, just it's just an example you gave, but the law in New Jersey, this is an existing law. It's not a
yeah,
new
yeah,
coronavirus law.
no, 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 it was an existing law that
And
is.
so, what do they use it for? Like historically, what do people get?
um,
What are people doing when they get
when they spread false
prosecuted for
information,
this law?
right?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I have to tell you, I honestly don't know. I have
No,
not
no,
looked
it's
into
not like
it.
it happens every day. It's a kind of a
No, no, and I mean, in particularly that particular law, I haven't looked into to see how they've usually applied it. But I would imagine for for something like a criminal law where because you're imposing that strong a penalty on spreading false information, that it's going to have to be something that is going to cause a pretty significant harmful responsive action, right? You're telling people something that's going to, I mean, you could almost imagine the old Orson Welles, War of the Worlds style of spreading a rumor. I mean, people shouldn't have necessarily believed it was an alien invasion, but something where people are going to respond quickly and very negatively and inflict a public harm.
Now,
So,
how difficult is that to prove in a case like this? Like COVID is one of the things that people make a big deal about is the curve, right? The exponential growth.
right,
So it's like they try
sure,
to make it very salient that your minor actions can have really large repercussions later on. So like,
right.
how does the justifying restriction speech interact with that?
I mean, realistically, this is why it's so difficult actually um, to enforce a law like that in the context of where there's a whole lot of information that is still very up in the air. People don't know, there are rumors being spread and so on. The First Amendment generally creates a very wide berth for that kind of speech on the assumption that we are going to be good consumers of information and go out and try to figure out what's true and what isn't and take things that we read initially with a grain of salt, and that the marketplace of ideas will provide enough speech and counter speech that we'll be able to find the truth. And so we don't rely on the law to try to stop people saying things that are false or wrong. We rely on people's ability to get to that truth through just conversation and research and that kind of thing. So yeah, because it is very hard to pin down the truth. I mean, and of course, truth today may change tomorrow. I mean, ideas that were deeply held in one era have been disproved through future, science.
I guess
So
the things
a
I
lot of
can think
these,
of where I'm trying to think what are our real, we just started with speech. There's lots of other rights at play, but
mhm,
when I think of speech, the examples I keep coming up with, I can't decide whether those are appropriately considered speech
mhm,
acts, or whether they're really something else. So like, like suppose I start a new online business where I sell people fake cures
right,
for coronavirus. So they send me money and I send them some vitamins or something
right,
with a new label. It's total nonsense. There's no connection whatsoever.
yeah,
People do that all the time currently, whether it's coronavirus or not. And it's I don't know, you know is
yeah.
that spreading false information? I mean, in a sense, yeah, kind of.
Yeah,
But
well, yeah. So no, it's a good question. And I will refrain from too much editorializing about the concept of injecting bleach. But in any event,
yeah, this is
um,
not, it's pretty
no,
on the point actually. But I mean, we don't have
well,
to use that example. There are literally other
there
fake
are
drugs on the
others,
market.
but and we have had upheld as consistent with the First Amendment for a long time. There's been this notion of commercial speech, which is different from, I mean, the pure form First Amendment protection. The sort of classic conception of the speech that's protected is speech that lets us self govern. It's political speech, it's speech about policies and ideas and concepts, as opposed to speech that is part of a commercial transaction, which for a long time in
It's
US
like
law has
marketing and
gotten
advertising.
marketing and
Get a pass.
advertising, right? Exactly. Well, and so the courts have recognized over the years that uh, it, up until arguably recently, that there's a kind of second class status for commercial speech, that there's a greater ability to regulate it, partly out of a notion that it's not the sort of core speech that the First Amendment is most concerned with, but also because commercial speech has the potential to do the sorts of things that you're describing, right? So we don't, well, first of all, we don't want to protect fraud. Fraud has never been protected under the First Amendment. Literally lying to someone to get them to give you money for something that is not what they're thinking they're paying for. I mean, that's just never been protected under the First Amendment. But even beyond that, there's always been regulation of things like marketing, for example. And in the drug context that you're talking about, we have a whole regime, the sort of Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which regulates both when you can actually interject a product into the market and make claims about it and about whether it's going to be beneficial health wise, whether it's going to be harmful or not, whether it'll be effective, et cetera. There's an existing and already legally approved and constitutionally blessed ability to regulate that. Now there are some outer boundaries of that, um, but and some constitutional outer boundaries of that. Um, but yeah, I mean, you could literally uh, enforce the existing laws about marketing a product, for example, against someone who is out there holding themselves out with the new cure-all and selling it for that purpose. So,
And
yeah.
So other examples, like if we move away from the marketing example,
Mhm.
marketing, snake oil product or something like that, we don't need special rules. There's already plenty of ways to regulate that if we decide we want to.
Mhm.
Uh, the other things that we're thinking of are like, if I want to go and stand on some corner or make an awesome web page saying that a particular group of people, particular racial group or something like that, is the source of the virus. Stay away
Yeah.
from them. And I want to warn everybody about this. Tell them
Mhm.
this kooky idea. Uh,
Right.
Stopping me from doing that might well be infringing on my freedom of speech, and we'd have to ask ourselves:
Yeah.
is are we in a moment where we're willing to make
Mhm.
that infringement because it's more important today than normally? Is that the kind of thing we're talking about? That would be more in the first
Mm.
camp, the not commercial speech, really, just point of
That's not
view.
yeah, that wouldn't be commercial speech. If you're in the sort of full bore, full First Amendment protection. And by the way, I should mention on the commercial speech, a few years ago, the Supreme Court uh, suggested in a case involving the sale of drug prescription information, that they might start to do away with this distinction in protection, levels of protection between commercial speech and sort of regular political speech, and treat all speech the same in terms of looking at the justification and the amount of justification to interfere with it. That hasn't fully happened yet, but in any event, well, I'm watching
Could
that
be.
with some interest. But to your point, I mean, the most recent example you gave, um, for something like that, yeah, if the government wanted to prevent you from saying those sorts of things, then and tried to interfere with that, that would full on implicate the First Amendment, unless what you were doing rose to or sunk maybe to the level of incitement. So there's another category of speech that falls outside the scope of First Amendment protection, and it's speech that is directed at and likely to produce imminent lawless action. So the classic example is not someone sitting on the internet typing up something, but it would be standing on a corner or standing in a mob and giving a speech that's whipping up a crowd to an enthusiastic, lawless action.
Uh,
Where the mob is going to act
so
before
here,
time. So
rallying everybody up to come out of their house and stop practicing social distancing might be
yeah.
the example,
Right,
I suppose.
exactly. Well, it could, and one of the issues has been traditional incitement has not. It's been a face-to-face thing. What happens when you translate that to the internet? Because if I'm sitting on my computer, in theory at least, there's the time for me to step back, let my cooler head prevail, and not make a rash decision in the way that traditional incitement would suggest. No, no, when you're in a mob, you just suspend your own kind of
Mhm.
independent judgment and you go along with the mob. um, in the context of actually terrorist recruitment, there has been some discussion about whether we have to rethink incitement for a digital world where you've got people who are sitting on their computers and just ingesting video after video, blog post after blog post. And even though they're there alone, they're getting radicalized or they're, in
Mhm.
one form or another. and they would be incited to go out and commit a lawless act. So, if we go down that road, then inciting people to violate lockdowns and potentially expose lots of people to public health risks, you know, potentially that kind of speech would then fall outside the scope of First Amendment protection. So it's difficult. It's frankly difficult, but there are a few things that are worth mentioning. I mean, one is um, the government is not the only one who can control that kind of speech. Remember, all of that sort of speech is happening on private platforms like Twitter and Facebook and everything, and they can pull that stuff down irrespective
Anytime
of
they
the
want.
First Amendment because it doesn't apply to them, right? So unless there's some other type of statutory obligation for them to not take that stuff down, um, they can go ahead and regulate, and
Right.
people have
But if the
no
government tries to
recourse.
tell Twitter that they have to take it down, that's
Yeah.
overreach. I
That's
mean,
yeah.
normally
Yeah,
it would
I
need a
mean,
big rule.
it could be, right? It could be. Now, remember, no rights are absolute. Okay, so that's very worth mentioning. Absolutely none of our rights are absolute. And so even with speech, even with the most protected speech, the government can regulate or punish it if it meets a standard in law that we call strict scrutiny, which basically boils down to, does the government have a compelling interest to interfere with the speech? And is it regulating in a narrow enough way to just serve that compelling interest and not go further than it needs to? And so, if it can meet that standard, which is very difficult by design, it's basically saying, hey, government, you have to have a super strong reason to do this. But if it can meet that standard, then it can actually interfere.
Are there
Um,
some examples? Like, are there classic examples that you would teach in a class? Like, what's an example of some speech
mhm,
that was legitimately or viewed by the courts to be
uh-huh,
uh,
to meet strict scrutiny.
meets?
Um,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it is difficult, but it's not impossible. One of the actually probably strongest examples that's a classic example because it doesn't just involve interfering with speech. It involves trying to stop speech before it occurs, which we really don't like in the First Amendment world. We usually would rather let people speak and then be responsible for their speech if it causes harm after the fact, as opposed to imposing what we call a prior restraint. But for example, preventing someone from publishing imminent troop movements, right, in wartime. So, because the idea is if you're going to disclose or, classified information rules and all the penalties that would come about if you disclose classified information, because the harm from that is seen as so great, the government has a compelling interest to prevent it or at least to punish it after the fact. So that's a classic example.
If I could ask us to maybe wander around a bit in the First
Sure.
Amendment here. One of the other components is assembly, right? Being able to
Yeah.
get together in groups, and at least as a yeah, an
Yeah.
American citizen growing up, you heard about the idea of this was where people came to debate ideas and figure out and adjudicate truth and everything. So it was important that it be bundled with speech.
Mhm.
And now we've got this kind of cases like, well, no more than 10 people at a time or something, for a sheltering in place. Don't
Right.
get in groups.
Right.
And if you do, 6 feet apart. I had never even thought about like what constitutes assembling in a group. How far away do we have to be before we're no longer like assembling in a group and stuff. So
Right.
how should I think about this in the code? Like what is it that kind of grants the power to limit group size in this kind of context?
It's the ability to articulate a compelling interest and need, and then to identify whether you're interfering with what would be a fundamental right. Because I think it's fair to call that a fundamental right. I mean, most of the rights that you see expressly listed in the Bill of Rights are fundamental in nature, and so in order to regulate, the government typically needs to, depending on how they're regulating, they need to meet that very high standard of justification. So the same would be true for the right of freedom of assembly. So that but it's a question of, does the government have a good enough reason to interfere with what you're doing? And
Well,
from a public health standpoint, the answer is probably yes, if you can show that coming
That's right.
together within 3 feet of each other or groups of 500 is going to spread a deadly illness.
Well, that's, I guess, part of it. So, like, to what extent do they have to maybe defend 10? Like, why not 11? Why not 9?
Uh-huh. Right.
What is the science to
Right.
back up 10? I guess
Yeah.
is like
Well, look,
hard
the
to do.
government's. I mean, there's sort of the legal answer and there's the practical answer, right? Because the sort of pure theoretical answer, I'm not even sure that's going to require that we be super precise about 9 versus 10. The requirement to regulate as narrowly as possible or narrowly tailor your regulation to serve that compelling interest does impose an obligation of precision greater than our standard baseline requirement of justification when the government does anything. I mean, the government always has to have some reason, some rational basis for acting, right? But that's a really low bar. Okay. Um, Meeting the much higher level of justification, strict scrutiny requires more precision. Whether it's super precise, 10 versus 11, my guess is they've got, a little more slack, particularly in things like public health, where the information itself is evolving and moving. They're going to be able to do the best they can. And frankly, courts are going to give them a fair amount of slack.
Do you have
Who wants to be the judge that says, oh, no, 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 you got it wrong. It should only be, 5.2 feet from each other. So go redo this. I mean, yeah.
for something like group size, does the burden on the government increase or decrease as you vary the group size? Like, would it be harder for them to defend a maximum group size, say, of 2, or would it be harder for them to defend a maximum group size of like 5,000? Like at 5,000, it seems like it'd be somewhat hard to defend. Like, it seems like you're just targeting maybe a
Yeah.
handful of possible events in that kind of case. Like, what's the meaningful difference?
Protests and
Yeah,
professional sports, those are banned. Everything else is okay.
yeah.
Something.
Well, I mean, the government does have to come forward when it's interfering with something that's really basic, really fundamental, like the right to travel or the right to assemble, right? Like we're talking about now. It does have to do a good job explaining the link between the rules it's putting out there and the outcome that it is intending to achieve, the public health outcome and the risk to public health. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that we can talk about the sort of the terminology of talking about this, strict scrutiny and compelling interest and all that. uh, at the end of the day, it's going to boil down to someone second guessing and challenging a judgment that's made by a public health official or another government official about how to handle this, and putting that before a judge who's also a human being, who's going to be looking at this and saying, okay, so how much justification, how much data am I going to require? Like, I need to require a decent amount because what is being interfered with is pretty basic, okay, and pretty important. Um, but, is it, am I going to say you can only impose these rules once you have 24 peer-reviewed studies from public health scholars who say that this is the precise number
Yeah.
at which the disease
I mean,
spreads? No,
it's
because you're
it's
dealing with an
tricky.
evolving situation, right? So,
It seems to me, I have no experience with this whatsoever. I'm with you in the sense that it feels like these things are not going to get overturned by
right.
courts this time around anyway. But who knows? Because the basic argument sounds straightforward. What I guess sounds complicated to me is that there's some baseline level. All these activities that are normally allowed, right?
Right.
Go and hang out at like a shopping mall or something like that, or assemble wherever it is that you want to assemble. Normally you're allowed to do this. It is always true that gathering in groups like that is an excellent way to transmit a communicable disease of various kinds from one person to the next, and that probably happens all the time, right? Like there are all sorts of other
Yeah.
illnesses. So what we're saying is, like, normally, I don't know, I guess we're like comfortable with that baseline level of risk. Right now, the current disease that's circulating, right, transmits much more quickly and kills people more. So like it's above our level of tolerance, and so now it's justified, right? Like that's the kind of
right. It's the
weighing of the two things.
That's right. When you talk about a compelling interest, do you have a compelling interest in stopping people from gathering in the mall if they're going to spread mono, okay, versus if they're going to spread COVID-19, right? On the mono side, people are going to be indisposed, and some may lose their tonsils or whatever else they have to do to deal with that, but they're not going to die in numbers as opposed to this. Which is it's much more drastic. And so the level of the government's interest in taking measures that are extraordinary is much higher. Let me give you a couple of examples just to try to get a little bit more at this, because I think you're trying to get, as good social scientists, like how much data do we need to make this decision and justify this decision. So just talking back about a First Amendment case from a while ago, and the state of California passed a law that required minors who wanted to buy really violent video games, like the worst of the worst video games. And they used all kinds of adjectives in the state law to try to describe how bad these things were. You know, first person, where you were killing, brutally maiming people, and so on. They said, look, minors, people below the age of 18, are not going to be allowed to buy these themselves unless they're accompanied by a parent or a guardian. And the video game industry challenged this as a violation of their First Amendment rights. Okay, it's their sort of creative product that they're selling and expressing, and this is halting some sales and so on. So anyway, this case gets to the Supreme Court, and the majority concludes, yes, there is an expressive interest here that triggers First Amendment protection, and it is content based. The rule is trying to limit certain types of expression, certain types of content, because of that content, which is exactly what we typically don't want the government to do, right? Is picking and choosing among what we can be exposed to and hear and discuss. And so they said, you have to meet strict scrutiny. And in that case, the majority said, we don't see it. You're telling us that the government's compelling interest in stopping kids from being able to walk into a video store and buy this themselves is that they're going to play these first-person shooter games, and then they're going to go out and shoot people, or they're going to be violent. It's going to raise their threshold of violence. But we don't see the data. Come back when you have more data to actually show us this. The studies that you're showing us, first of all, we can't tell whether in a couple of the studies where young kids experience greater anxiety levels and some sort of social tension after playing the games, they may be of that personality to begin with, and they self-select into playing the games, the court said. So there's not enough data there. Now the
See,
dissent.
now that is a high standard. Like, I don't know if you've read the epi literature lately, but it's not that much better on how big does a group have to be before you catch coronavirus.
Yep.
It's maybe a little better than the video game research, but not that much better. I mean, it's very hard to study something like that. It's not like we randomly assign people to be in big groups during a giant epidemic or not, and see how many more of them get the, like, that's a good study of that, if you could do that literal little experiment. But we have nothing like that most of the time. Have even in the computer simulations, but you just make up the parameters. I mean, you force it to be true. So I mean,
even in the video game case, it's hard to sort out for exactly the same reasons. We can't randomly assign video game exposure very easily among minors.
I mean,
all sorts of
but we
human
don't.
subjects will prevent you from doing that. Yeah.
Well, but and actually it's ironic, but I mean, the dissent in that case, Justice Breyer disagreed and said, look, there is a lot of data on this. And he listed, study after study after study that he was persuaded. And of course, what he said was, look, I may be persuaded by all of this, but maybe the more important point is the legislature was persuaded by all of this. So don't set such a high constitutional standard that you cripple the ability of the people's elected representatives to make a judgment about how they want to set these rules. Because
I guess as a social scientist who doesn't always have access to a clinical trial, I favor the idea that the Supreme Court does not say it must be an RCT or I won't believe it. Because all the applied economics research out there would be worth literally nothing under that scenario. And
Mhm.
maybe that's justifiable, but it would depress me a little.
Well, the one thing
Um,
you it's
be
the
a
one
bit
thing it's
defeatist, I guess, is my idea.
yeah. But you do, you sort of want to keep an eye on when the court asks for a lot of research and when it doesn't. So, like in the gerrymandering case that came out a few years ago involving Wisconsin, where the Chief Justice called, you know, the test, the standard being used there to tell whether gerrymandering, political gerrymandering, had gone too far. He called it sociological gobbledygook. Okay, and so that was one of these calls for, on the one hand, show us a lot of strong information as to why we should
But
interfere with
not too much.
political process, but
It's
not
too
too.
complicated.
I know, but not stuff that we don't get. So that was one example, but the other one, just to again give you a sense of like how this plays out in real life. um, During Easter, uh, a case arose where a church wanted to gather for a drive-in Easter service, and in Kentucky. And in Louisville, the city was kind of discouraging people from doing this. They were discouraging services. They were certainly discouraging in-person services and gatherings because of the coronavirus. And they even said, "Don't do the drive-in things. We discourage that too." And this church challenged that, went to court, and got an order restraining the city from enforcing its lockdown rules as against this drive-in church service. And the reason why the judge issued the order was that the city was not cutting off all, if you will, parking lot activity that felt comparable to what the church was doing. Right. So, in other words, you could drive in and have enough, all the same number of cars in a Kroger parking lot, or in, somewhere else that people were just shopping, and he called out liquor stores in particular. People could still go to liquor stores. They could do drive-through type things. But
So this
so
is interesting. Do
yeah.
you think that so that this judge so he said, you know, you can't shut down the church outdoor thing because they're about the same level of risk as these other activities which you allow,
Right.
basically, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me, and maybe the government would be on no firmer grounds on this front, but like maybe the government is saying, true, they're all risky, but people got to eat. They got to go to the grocery store, so it's essential. So that like
Yeah.
they're drawing a distinction between like which risky activities you're going to be like, well, I got to have an exception for that, otherwise we'll all die anyway.
Yeah.
Uh, and then they were saying initially we didn't put religion in that category, and the judge is like, well, you should have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me say, food, you could probably make that argument. Liquor was a little
Liquor,
harder.
no, I agree. Well,
Judging.
there's all sorts of like the essential definitions are fairly absurd sometimes,
Yeah.
but is it illegal to have the concept of essential as the
It's
differentiating factor, or is it?
No, I wouldn't say that. The problem is, though, when when you define what is essential, you are going to come up against what the Constitution also identifies as essential. And in the hands of any given judge, I mean, I will say this judge, who's a fairly new judge, um, issued an opinion that I was very struck by when it issued, because there's a lot of sort of language in there about religion, the importance of religion, and not in the sort of usual clinical way that courts sort of talk about the importance of religion, because it is something that the Constitution protects very strongly. It sort of waxes on a lot about it in ways that go sort of above and beyond what's
What was
necessary
needed
to
for this?
decide the case. But what he is doing is underscoring that there's such strong protection for free exercise of religion in this country, that that's already carved out as essential by the Constitution. So the government can identify other things as essential,
Who
but
wants
it's
to add
going to
liquor
stop
stores?
this.
Fine, but you start with religion
Uh,
in the
yeah, and if
Constitution.
and the judge said, look, I'm not saying that you could never tell people they can't gather, but if you're going to do that and you're going to stop them from doing something that is so essential in our fabric of our society, then you better be consistent about where you're seeing the risk emerge. Because if you're letting people do the same exact sort of actions in a non-religious context that poses the same risk of spreading the disease, then you have no justification for interfering with this fundamental right. So we haven't shown it. It was a very, limited record and a very speedy order because they literally came to him on the eve of Easter. So there wasn't a whole lot of time to go into the niceties of were they factually going to do something different from people buying liquor and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
And so do elections fit into this same kind of essential feature in this way from a constitutional perspective? Like that's why you could have a shelter in place law but suspend an election? Or sorry, the other way around.
Oh.
You can have a shelter in place but say that you can't suspend the election. I think that's what Wisconsin did as well, right? So that's such an essential factor that you can't defer it.
Yeah, I mean, elections are very important, and so our system's sort of basically grounded in the notion of our being able to choose our own representatives, and it would be very difficult to really suspend or postpone, I think, elections constitutionally in this when there are other alternatives, right?
Yeah.
And that is the underlying reason for it. It's this specifically, the essentiality of it.
Now, if you wanted to alter it, so I thought I didn't follow that closely, but in Wisconsin, was not part of the goal not to cancel or postpone the election at all, but merely to extend the amount of
it was to extend the time for absentee ballot voting, right?
And that too, though, is tampering with things as far as the. I mean, that's what this court held. I mean, but.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court basically said, look, it's going to change the character of the election if now you extend the ability for people to actually cast votes as opposed to only posting the votes that they had already cast by the original official date. And the idea was that people will come to the polls if they hear the reporting about how the election was going, and that may sway the election in a way that it would not have gone otherwise.
So if we're reading in a little bit, but if Wisconsin had decided now, the election's over, if they decided now to have a law which expanded the length of time for absentee ballots for all future elections, the court would be fine with that. It's trying to do any kind of last minute alteration to the thing that they don't like.
That was that was very much premised on the notion that this is the 11th hour and you can't change the rules because you may change the substantive outcome of the election.
So long absentee voting procedures, no reason to think that's unconstitutional.
No,
you can't do it. You can't do it 2 days before you do the thing. That's that's not okay.
Right. I mean, that would be the issue. And that, of course, suggests that if we're looking to fall 2020, where, who knows where we'll be in fall 2020, but
we should get cracking right now. Otherwise we'll be in the middle of it.
We should get cracking right now, because I mean, it could be that we have some of the same concerns in the fall about people doing in-person voting and whether that's still going to pose a risk. Right.
So funny, I'm Canadian, so I can't vote, but I always think, like, suppose you did this right now, like, would I know who I'd want to vote for this far away from November?
Yeah.
I don't. Well, we're not supposed to talk politics right now.
No, we can if you want. I mean, but we don't know. But it doesn't, from the standpoint, I mean, if you started, absentee ballots or, early voting, I guess would be the better way to put it. If you start early voting this early, you're going to have to make a pretty calculated guess, but we don't really have even the confirmed nominee at this point. We sort of do, but, on the Democratic side, we know who the Republican is at the federal level. Lots of other elections going on too, though. So states are going to have to figure out how they're going to handle it for the fall.
One of the things that triggers me a little bit is like, it's difficult for me to actually identify what it is that I actually want here. So like, do I want Wisconsin to make it okay for the government to suddenly like alter an election procedure somehow? Because, this is like the beginning of every science, fiction dystopia or something, like V for Vendetta or something. It starts off with there's like biohazard attack or something, and then they basically end up never having the elections ever again, you know.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but I suppose this is supposed to be where we have the counterbalancing forces where states are running the elections, and
Right.
so like it can't be that the president per se is able to cancel the elections, but because the states run them,
Right. The
right?
states run their own elections. I mean, state level
Yeah,
elections, it's totally a matter of states. And then even the rules for how they're electing representatives to Congress, for example, and so on, the states also start out organizing all that, but constitutionally Congress can change that if it wants to. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's very distributed, it's very decentralized, and which on the one hand can make it infuriatingly inefficient, one could say, but on the other hand is a protection against people being able to interfere on a mass scale with elections. So
It is
um,
such a tricky one, I think. Like, Justin's science fiction framing of it's not that science fiction-y at all, right? Like there's plenty of examples
it's
where
happening right now elsewhere in the world, right? I mean,
exactly, right,
look at
where you
Hungary. I
use
mean,
exactly, you use some
yeah,
kind of calamity as a power grab. Canceling an election is an excellent way to do that.
yeah,
That's
for sure.
standard stuff for a take over a country kind of
Yes.
objective, right? Uh, it's so funny though, because in these, or it's vexing, I guess, because the reason you put up all these protections and you should take seriously any attempt to change them is that this is exactly what somebody would say if they were trying to, you know, circumvent democracy. They would be like, oh, it's not
bad flu season.
forever.
Yeah,
It's
It's
not forever.
temporary, but I mean, we'll all die if you go right now, so we can't have an
Yeah.
election. That's exactly the kind of thing they say. On the other hand,
Mhm.
sometimes it's true, right? Like you should have the election, and they're not trying to be a dictator. It really comes down to like how much
Yeah.
you trust that this is not a bad act. It's just
Well, I
practicality.
mean, so much.
Um,
I mean, we can design, a system that distributes power in an effort to prevent anyone from getting too much power, which is why our system has all the levels it does and the
sure.
separation of powers and so on. Um, but when we confront a crisis like this, I mean, so much actually does come down to, do we trust our leadership? Right? And I don't know that I'd want to necessarily trust leadership to the point of suspending elections that can be conducted.
No,
Um,
me neither.
but,
I mean, I don't.
and even postponements. I mean, one of the things that, you really sort of look for is, wait a minute, who's asserting the right to do this? Because if you go back to um, World War II, for example, where there was a crying need for emergency powers and executive authorities, right? Well, there were different ways to do that. Hitler more or less declared the need for the powers, got a sort of weak leader to authorize him as he rose as chancellor, and then there was no looking back. I mean, he basically got a whole lot of power and took it and ran with it. And unlike in England, where effectively Parliament gave Winston Churchill extraordinary powers to conduct the war without going back to Parliament all the time to ask the legislature for, authority to do various things. But the idea was, once the war was over, they were going to take that power back. So you want the ability for someone to exercise power that is needed to meet the moment, but you don't want them to be the one to declare when that moment is going to be over, because it'll never be over at that point, because who willingly gives up emergency power? And frankly, even when you have another body like a legislature, like Congress, for example, it only matters if they actually assert their own power in the system, because we've had plenty of presidential national emergencies declared over many years in this country, and Congress actually has. But Congress both gave the president the power statutorily to do that, and it has the power to stop those emergencies. It has to review them every 6 months, and it can declare them over, right? But it almost has never done so. We have national emergencies on the books for decades. Okay. So it really, where is that sort of aggressive check and balance? It only
I suppose
exists.
like a question is, on some level, what is so in a lot of these examples you're talking about, the emergency situation, which technically gives
Mhm.
the executive branch additional power, that
Hmm.
would need to be formally retracted
Yeah.
by Congress if it was going to take back that power. Uh, if it's over in reality and the executive branch no longer using that power to do anything weird or problematic, right? Then Congress just like can't be bothered. Like, what difference does it make? Guy's not
Well,
doing anything with
right.
this power. I just let it hang there on the books. I mean, you can sort of understand how it happens just because they're like, I don't know, we got other things to do.
Yeah.
This is like a meaningless thing. Be
No,
another thing
I
if this guy
totally
was
understand.
using this
Yeah.
power continually to like
Yeah.
do all sorts of stuff
Hmm.
from an emergency that has been over for 35 years. We should probably
Right.
rein it in. But maybe it's
Right.
just because it doesn't matter, basically, right? But
Yeah.
um,
No, well, I think that's probably right, is they just let it go and then they move on to something else if it's not posing an immediate issue. I mean, you could look at, post 9/11, immediately in the wake of 9/11, Congress passed something called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. And the way that that is worded, it basically authorizes the president to use uh, any force that is needed to go after the go after Al Qaeda and those who were supporting Al Qaeda. And as the war on terror has evolved and the players have evolved to, ultimately to ISIS, for example, the question has been, hey, wait a minute, along the way, has the president used the authorization for the use of military force to engage in a whole lot of operations which might be beyond the scope of what was originally authorized by Congress? Now, if Congress is okay with what he's doing, maybe they don't interfere, but there have been calls in the last few years, not just under President Trump, but before that under President Obama, to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we need to regroup as Congress and either reauthorize with something that actually covers what is now happening, or rein it in if we think we disagree with what's going on. Um, but part of the problem with that is even that authorization needs to be approved by the president, a new authorization. So it needs to be veto proof. So,
So one I haven't seen challenged yet among these essential rights, so we've talked about voting and
mhm,
religion and others. Where will
yeah,
protests fit in this? Right. So it's the act of assembly and speech.
sure.
It seems to me a fairly like a essential idea
Yeah.
concept. Is it going to find itself in challenge, or are there going to be instances in which they're going to
Uh,
say, the threat is high enough that you can't congregate in front of the state house and breathe on the windows and
yeah,
do
right.
other things, and
Well, it depends y-
or
let
maybe
me
what would it
let me
take
back up.
to get it there? I guess like
Yeah.
where it's
I mean,
actually something
ca-
that the government could reasonably restrain.
the government is able to restrain the time, place, and manner in which speech occurs with a lesser showing of justification than if it is trying to restrain speech based on its content or the viewpoints expressed, right? So we already have um, a lot of rules about whether people can hold parades and when, or whether I can take a bullhorn outside your house at 3 a.m. and shout where I want. I mean, it doesn't matter what I'm saying, you don't want to hear it at 3 a.m. From me with a bullhorn and a big speaker next to me. And so not all regulation of speech triggers that strict scrutiny standard that we were talking about before. That's really reserved for when the government is trying to suppress certain ideas or certain viewpoints and pick and choose. Okay. So, like when Coady was talking about, I want to stand on a street corner and say that X, racial group is responsible for the coronavirus. Okay. And the government's trying to suppress that idea. But if it's, hey, you can speak all you want about it's time to lift the lockdown, it's time to get back to work, this is outrageous, etc., and you can say that we're not going to interfere, but we don't want you gathering to do it because when you physically gather, that's when you're actually posing a risk. You're posing a risk of
Hmm.
actually spreading a disease, and so in order to have time, place, and manner restrictions, those restrictions, the government has to show that that they are narrowly tailored to serve a substantial government interest, an important government interest, and they leave open ample alternative channels for communication. Okay. So that's, people usually they want to protest how they want to protest. And they will say things like, only if we do it in this way and only if we gather together will it be effective. There's certain ways of conveying a message which are likely to pack more punch than others. And the government has to pay attention to that. It can't say, no, no, we get to choose how you protest, except that it can, in fact, be neutral as to the message, but say, look, protesting live while we don't know who's got this, okay, and who's infected and who isn't, and it's just going to create too great a public health risk. My guess is that could pass muster. I think they could probably. Now, will governments want to stop these protests? That's a whole other matter. Is whether or not
It's
they
ironic whether
protect together.
they will want to or be willing to, right?
Mhm.
Almost certainly depends on how many people want to go to one of these protests. It's a
Yeah.
bit endogenous. If there's mass protests, meaning people really are against, enforced, quasi-enforced social distancing, right?
Yeah.
Seems like the ability of the government to be like, and your protests are banned too, right? Good luck with that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
one thing if it's like 50 people, right? You're like, see, crazy people protesting. I'm going to restrict their rights, okay? And everybody will be like, do it. You might get away with it then, right?
Although ironically, the higher numbers pose the greter risk, right?
Yes, of
Potentially.
course.
So, yeah. And then the other thing is some people have been coming to these protests um, armed. I don't know if you've noticed that, but a few of
But
them
they always
with
start
arms
coming to
as well.
protests armed in
Yeah.
America, don't you think? That's my experience of this place.
As a Canadian, you're looking at this and
I'm
saying,
always
"What is it with
surprised
all
when I
these
see that.
guns?"
I'm like, whoa, that's
Actually,
different from Canada.
one of the
There's
first,
not that many differences.
but this is
One.
different. I can see this difference. One of the first lawsuits that was filed, coronavirus lawsuits, and there are many, a legion types of lawsuits right now being filed across a wide range of issues. But one of them was when gun stores were part of the lockdown. And some people filed lawsuits claiming that this was a violation of Second Amendment rights, both the sellers and I think potential buyers. Right. So the right to keep and bear arms. But you have people showing up to protest with guns. And that always raises a question of, well, how do you balance Second Amendment and First Amendment rights? Because on the one hand, if you want robust protest and robust speech, it could chill speech for other people to come with guns in an open carry setting because you really don't know what's going to happen, and that can really escalate potentially, tense situation into some violence. I saw that Mississippi's governor, I think now I'm trying to remember if it was a mayor of a city or I can't remember. It might have been the mayor of Jackson, but had suspended the state's open carry law because of concerns that things are tense enough and people are on edge because of this COVID situation. We don't need people walking around with guns.
Now, does
well.
that right there,
Uh-huh.
and I admit I'm not steeped in this part of American culture very well. That seems like a very sensible point of view to me. Like my fear at when I witness the guns in the protesting environment, right? My fear is not the tension between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. That never crosses my mind. Like, oh, this is troubling. How will one navigate this breakdown? Right? It's more like the whole idea of a protest is that it's a bit wild and people get very emotional and set up.
Yeah.
It's a terrible place to have a bunch of guns. It just doesn't seem like a wise move. You might want people. The whole point is to have people get a little bit out of control, perhaps. But there's probably a public health interest in it not turning into some kind of wild riot. This is not the goal generally.
Well,
but
and
it
I think,
happens.
and I think after the Charlottesville riot, I think that has retrained people's
to think,
attention on the risk, of people showing up to a protest situation with weapons, right? Whatever side or both sides of an issue they may be on. So,
but is that the kind of argument that, like, what this was it Amara who did this?
you know,
Uh,
I just will have to look back
you
and
weren't
see.
sure
I
yet.
saw it
It's
so
okay. It doesn't.
fast.
It's not important.
Yeah,
But
I, I want to say the governor
the
was
argument
wrong.
that this person made, would that kind of claim hold up in court? Is that an argument for why you can abridge one of the two rights, Second or First Amendment? Because
Well, you
just
know,
not the time for that. People are already stressed
yeah,
enough. Seems like
yeah. I mean, I think
no to me. It doesn't sound like a very constitutional law style argument to me. But
one of the
you
things
know.
we don't really have in the Second Amendment world yet is a firm sense of how much justification the government needs to interfere with the right to keep and bear arms. So the Supreme Court has not really um, said firmly how much justification the government will need, whether they're going to have to meet that strict scrutiny standard, really high level, compelling interest, narrow regulation, or whether it's going to be something less than that. So far, they have not said strict scrutiny. They've said that the very few cases at the Supreme Court have dealt with Second Amendment rights. And where they've struck down laws, they've struck them down as being irrational. So they don't even meet the lowest level of scrutiny, right? They're just not rational. So, but that's usually a pretty low threshold to meet. And a lot of lower courts have been upholding a variety of gun restrictions. So, we don't really know um, in any kind of firmly established way uh, whether or not something like I just described in Mississippi is going to fly. This is a really evolving area of the law right now, and it's evolving through case after case, basically.
Can I ask you a question? This goes somewhat beyond what we had done a bit of planning for, but if you're thinking about this current situation as a kind of a historical inflection point of some sort, we don't know what it will be.
Yeah.
If you had to guess, what are the domains of the law that are apt to experience a big hangover from this, a big change? Where is it going to be? Is it going to be in religious freedoms or speech or privacy or assembly? Where will we see maybe just a wholesale
Yeah.
change, a regime change in the way that we treat that, or none? Maybe we'll just muddle through and it'll be basically fine.
Yeah, I don't know that um, other than possibly privacy, we could talk a little bit about informational privacy and all this. Um, I don't know if I think it will have a long sort of tail or
Permanent
a
effect of some
major shift, because I think we've already got to Justin's original question about precedent. I mean, I think there was already precedent for the government's ability to intervene in ways that restrict individual liberty at a time of
right. Like, so
crisis.
far, what the
So
government has done has not been outside its historical portfolio. It's just applying past powers. It's a weird
yeah,
situation, maybe, but doesn't mean
it's an
anything
unusual
unusual.
situation, but yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's been, yeah, I wouldn't say, apart from some things that honestly I haven't looked into because of the time in the semester we're in right now, but over the summer I want to look into, and that has to do maybe a little bit more with the treatment of immigrants during this time and the way that they're housed and exposure of them. So I want to put that to one side because I think that needs some more careful attention to answer. But for some of this other stuff that we're talking about, I don't feel like I'm seeing anything that feels radically different or unusual or outside the scope of normal precedent. I've seen some interesting things come up in the privacy realm. You guys have probably seen the news around some of the states, Texas, Ohio, I think Arkansas, Oklahoma, that banned abortions um, for the stated reason that they didn't want they weren't essential medical procedures. If they weren't essential medical procedures, then abortion would be banned so that they weren't using up protective equipment and any other resources, right? And so that's part of an ongoing, I think, now for many years, but it's had a big spike over the last several years. An ongoing effort by states to restrict and ultimately try to do away with abortion in states that strongly oppose it for public policy reasons. So that's come up and has sort of flared up. It's gotten some pushback in the courts. Even the Fifth Circuit, which had upheld Texas's ban, has eased off that for medication abortion, for example, because there's no real, a connection between the use of protective physical equipment and surgical resources and things like that in medication abortion, for example. So that's, even that though, I would say is kind of, when I saw that happen, I thought it's part and parcel of this, ongoing effort to continue to regulate and restrict access to abortion. On the informational privacy side, I do think, but even here, this is part of a bigger phenomenon. When you're looking at contact tracing and what a number of countries are doing, and now what we're, looking at doing, using apps to track people and then make that information in some de-identified way available so that people can protect themselves against exposure to coronavirus or get tested if they've been exposed potentially. Um, you know, to be honest with you, given all of the data we give up about ourselves and our movements every single day to commercial actors, and then those data are available to the government with varying levels of court approval, right, for law enforcement and other purposes, even that doesn't feel all that wild and woolly to me. I mean, it feels a little, when you see the South Korean model of it, which has been quite effective, it feels radical to watch literally like dots on a map in real time, and you're able to see, oh, patient X has, coronavirus, and they've just gone to the post office, and then they've gone over here.
People love these. Nothing feels more like you're in a movie than when you see, some dots.
But even for that, like, we have a little bit of a historical, I guess, precedent for that, and that's although in a very different context, but it's for sex offenders. I mean, you can go. We have published location data for where sex offenders live. They're required to report those data. Those data are made available on the internet precisely for the reason that the public can judge whether they are at some level of risk of being near a convicted sex offender, because there is a sense, although I'm not sure the data necessarily bear this out, that they may have a higher recidivism rate, right?
So now you see that example, that analogy had not occurred to me previously. And I had been thinking that, this is probably not the right way to ponder this in my head, but I had been thinking, the right to privacy is overblown. It's not really that important to me. Look at all the stuff I clearly divulge on the internet. I don't even understand what it is. I just click OK to every one of these things so that I may look at a blog.
You don't read the terms of use?
I do not look at them. I don't. And I use the same password for too many websites sometimes, like, it's very bad. I shouldn't do these kinds of things.
You're
whatever.
Inviting a hacker right now.
I know. I said it right on the internet. It's stupid. I'm going to have to go change everything. Anyway, whatever. Privacy somehow seems like we don't take it very seriously most of the time. We freely give it up. Nobody wants to get their identity stolen. I suppose that's true. But and so the people who are, you hear columnists who are sort of like quite uncomfortable with the cell phone tracing programs, right? As though they don't use almost identical software currently to use targeted advertising, right? So I always think people sound ridiculous. We should, of course, do this. It would probably help, maybe not that much, but some. But then the sex offender thing, that sounds terrible. Like, imagine the use of the tracing program was to make a list of everybody who's infected and post it on the internet so that I may know if my neighbor could infect me. That's not
And
a good idea. I've never heard it described that way before, but like maybe it's a hop, skip, and a jump to like these like COVID lists.
well, there have been
I
a
wouldn't want
couple
to
of
be on one, I think.
cases, sure, and there have been a couple of cases, maybe more than a couple, in South Korea where people were able to combine other information and identify what was a de-identified dot on a map for the COVID
Sure.
purposes, and then people experienced some shunning and hurt feelings and some other
And
things.
indeed, there are these stories periodically. Mostly they seem like one-offs, but you do get these stories in the newspaper lately about like some random doctor in New York City whose condo board like won't let him into his place anymore or something because the other people think
Uh,
he'll be infected because he's working at a
oh, oh my gosh,
hospital where he has coronavirus or whatever. But
yeah, yeah, there you go. Well, and I
so I
just
mean,
want to be
he
clear
can't
on,
hide it because he's a
yeah,
physician. But I mean, if it was
right.
posted on the internet, this could be you too, right?
Right. Well, and this is why, first of all, let me just make clear, I am in no way
Endorsing it.
comparing. Well, I'm that
Oh,
too, but I'm not comparing someone who's been convicted of a crime with someone who just happens to get infected by coronavirus. It's more
no, but I know I understand.
the
But
risk of
I'm saying
harm, right? Okay.
the information disclosure of sensitive
Right.
information. It's for the same. Just
Right.
because you didn't molest anybody doesn't mean
Right.
that there
Doesn't mean
isn't a
you
social
might not be
penalty.
perceived as posing harm and you might not be penalized.
Exactly.
But I think, in terms of the app, I mean, this is where when I look at the countries that are using this and using it successfully, like South Korea, like Singapore, for example, there's a vast amount of trust in the government in terms of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. Okay, so the idea that this is limited data collection, it's being used for a limited purpose, it's not going to be the subject of mission creep and being used for the other things like what you were just describing. And we trust the government to actually do this. One of the big problems that we've had in this country is that unfortunately, the government has not behaved in a way with respect to data often that would engender that kind of trust. And I'm thinking here, for example, of two inspector general reports back to back a few years ago about how the FBI had misused some of its authority to get access to information, private information. And, in the wake of 9/11. And so it feels like such a pointless waste of the ability to get data for valuable uses like this, which I think the public would tolerate a lot of if it was assured that there were strong protections against misuse on the other side. So, eh, so at this point, for contact tracing purposes, I think what people are looking at is trying to get voluntary buy-in, right? And just saying this is, I mean, that's actually true. And I think in Singapore, it's
I wonder
voluntary as
what
well.
institution, if you were gonna really try to push and I don't know that we really ever will in the U.S. because it's such a fraught issue, but if you were gonna try to push sort of cell phone
Hmm.
app-based
Yeah.
tracing system, uh, the natural institutions you think of are the national security people or that you just totally do not trust with the information or the FBI or whatever. Because clearly, every time you give them anything, they have misused
Well,
it in recent history. This appears to be true. I wonder, though, who we would trust. Like the Census Bureau has
Google.
an impeccable record. Google's a
Right.
private company. They're like, we won't use it for evil. It's right in our slogan. Just use it to make the biggest profits we possibly can.
Right.
We know how to do it. Right? Like, maybe you do trust them more. I don't know. It seems to me the statistical agencies are the ones that would be most deserving of your trust, and yet I don't think we have high trust in them either.
Well, I think
But
right now we're in a particular period of concern about whether or not um, even what has been like longstanding sort of straight up civil servants are subject to a level of politicization in the
right,
agency proceedings that might undermine that trust. But I think right now, we are looking at commercial actors who are trying to develop these apps for voluntary uptake. And I know the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is very involved in advocating privacy protections and so on. I think they put out a white paper saying, hey, that, Apple, sort of Google, app that's being created for contact tracing, it should follow these sort of very standard principles that go back for about 50 years in terms of good privacy practices. So you only collect the data you need for the purpose. You don't use it for other things, certainly not without additional consent. You destroy it when it's not needed, and so on. You're transparent about what you're doing. So, if an
Yeah.
app, if a commercial app meets that kind of sort of privacy by design framework, then they can go out and say, "Hey, use this. It will help you." you know, it will
It's
actually help
pretty.
you.
Yeah.
It's really quite amazing when you think about the interaction of the government and the private sector here in the way that it really expands the capability of government. So like on the CARES Act, where the government wants to cut us all a check from the Treasury, they're like, guess what? We don't know your current address. It better be the same as the last time you filed taxes, because otherwise we don't have it. So like, if you want to check and you've moved, you need to file your taxes soon so you can get do it.
Right.
And then on the data privacy section, like, whoa, they maybe know where your dot is on the on the map. Like, and so I don't have this well sorted out in my head about like how should I think about the government's capability. Like when I think about their inability to know where I live
Okay.
from the Treasury's office, I'm like, yeah, seems like they're a long way away from like being able to really put the screws on me from a privacy
Possibly
perspective.
because they've intentionally.
Yeah.
I feel that some of that is just it's stupid snafu or something, I'm sure, but I think some of that is probably a function of regulations that the government has imposed on itself between different agencies and different data sources. Like, I'm sure the government does know your current address somewhere, right? But like there might be rules where they're like, there will be no merge statement between that data set and that data set ever.
Yeah, there are.
Don't
There
do
are
it,
federal limits.
right? And like if it's like that, then they're like, yes, I couldn't refresh it. It is illegal. I'm not going to refresh it. So file your taxes before I send you the check or something, right? It's not like a technical impossibility that they could do this.
Since we're kind of getting into this kind of interaction with the private sector and like to the extent to which people will actually just tolerate the government doing stuff, because presumably this is part of what the why people are maybe okay with giving their information to Google but not the government or something. But like one of the mechanisms for things to maybe advance is through like liability. So like maybe the government can't enforce shelter in place, and so there's this initial that we can basically nullify it because they can't survive the constitutional test or something. But while shelter in place is in effect, like, do we have any sense of like to what extent could I maybe hold my employer accountable if they don't properly adhere to it? Like, would I be able to potentially sue my employer for not?
Well, actually, one of the things that I just saw a blurb on was an idea being floated by the Trump administration to try to get legislative immunity for businesses to allow them to reopen, subject to some, basic safety practices. But there was a bit of a debate going on among some law professor folks on email about whether and whether they can or should do this at the federal level. For example, Congress has, just going back to guns for a second, Coady's favorite topic, Congress had passed a law that immunized gun manufacturers and distributors from liability under state tort law for people's illegal use of guns, right? So, Adam Lanza goes to Newtown, Connecticut, and shoots up a school. And now families of some of the children who died have gone to court to sue for negligent marketing and things like that caused this harm. That lawsuit has actually been allowed to go forward. It'll be very interesting to see where that goes, because Congress had passed a statute that mostly immunized the industry from liability, but created some exceptions, and they're trying to exploit those exceptions. Now there's a discussion about, well, what if to facilitate a reopening of the economy, we go ahead and just say no one's going to be able to sue business if they get sick, unless the business was grossly negligent or reckless, meaning they didn't follow the, certain types of cleanliness and social distancing guidelines when they reopen for their employees and customers. So that would take legislation. I mean, that's not something that President Trump or any executive could simply do.
It seems like the kind of thing, I guess I don't know. It's a litigious world, so I'm not sure how far-reaching the threat of lawsuits is for different kinds of businesses. It seems to me like businesses that are nursing homes, for example, or hospitals have likely the most important risk here. Maybe cruise ships, like places like this. Is it the case that like are we thinking like if I work at the grocery store and I work at the grocery store every day right in the thick of the coronavirus epidemic, and then I indeed get it, I can sue because my employer had me working through this and it was unsafe? Is that the kind of lawsuit we have in mind here? Or a customer
Well,
at a restaurant who thinks that they got coronavirus from the restaurant, how could they prove this ever? I don't know, but
I mean, partly it would be there would be a real proof issue, right? Because you'd have to trace how you got it. And in a world that we live in where we haven't tested very many people, and there could be lots of people walking around exposed, it would be incredibly difficult
yeah, I would think. I
to
mean,
particularly trace a source. But it also depends a lot on state tort law, right? So whether the state that you're working in, what its state statutes say and what state common law rules say about the obligations of your employer to provide a safe environment and how much risk is tolerated and that kind of thing. Um, so it would really depend. And strict liability, like I worked here and I got sick while I worked here, I'd be surprised if that was the norm or the rule. And again, you'd still have significant proof problems, as opposed to some negligence-based standard for liability. So, and in that case, then you're asking, whenever you're asking about negligence, you're asking, has there been a breach of a duty of care? So, what is the reasonable standard of care we would expect in that situation to go to employees or potentially
mm.
customers? And has there been a violation of that?
There has been a bit of discussion happening about, uh, if you've got a elderly,
By the way,
uh,
I just say there are also like workplace safety, like OSHA type laws at the state and federal level, which are other
could
statutes
apply.
that would come in there. Yeah. Yep.
Uh, with respect to nursing homes, there is I don't know if any resolution has happened on any of these fronts, but there were some stories for a while about if you have an older person who has uh, COVID-19 or is recovering or whatever, when you have to discharge them from the hospital, you might want to discharge them to a nursing home. And the question of whether the nursing home could either choose to deny entry to someone on the basis of their COVID-19 status, or the opposite, whether they could sort of be compelled to accept a person regardless of their COVID-19 status. It seems like that's the kind of thing that could produce lawsuits on either side. Like if they do accept the patient and I'm a patient at the nursing home, it was otherwise COVID-19 naive. Now we're all going to get COVID-19 because we brought in this
Yeah.
one sick person or whatever. It's not an unrealistic possibility, really.
Yeah.
I
It's,
wonder if
it's,
that seems to create real problems. One, like maybe there's a Coase theorem answer that you just need to decide which side the
yeah.
property right lies on here. But if you're a nursing home, surely uncertainty about that is a real problem.
I would imagine it is. And I mean, uh, behaving in a way that's going to be very isolating to each one of those patients, I would think, in order to reduce that risk.
Yeah,
So,
and whether they can easily even accomplish that, right? I mean, it
right.
sounds hard. I don't know.
I
Um,
I think it would be. I think those situations are incredibly difficult, because on the one hand, you want people obviously to get access to the care that they need, but on the other,
Right.
um, that's the most vulnerable, as far as we could tell, still the most vulnerable population. And so, in order to admit new patients, you'd have to really be scrupulous about how you're protecting against the spread. So, yeah. But I don't know. I mean, that's such a, you'd really have to look at um, what the laws of the state actually suggest, what the laws that regulate that industry
Mhm.
suggest. That's just uh, unfortunately not something I'm terribly familiar with. But yeah, what else do
Well,
you want to talk about?
this was a great discussion. So
This was fun.
yeah,
Yeah.
thanks again so much for chatting with us. This was great.
Oh, hey, no, I enjoyed it. This is huge fun. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens
Yeah,
next
please
every
come back. We'll
day.
do it again.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. Goodbye.
You bet. Have a great night.